Matthew 5:17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one tiny letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all takes place. Therefore, whoever abolishes one of the least of these commandments and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps them and teaches them, this person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness greatly surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. This is probably the most misinterpreted passage in all of the Torah movements. I think that it is also misunderstood in a lot of circles outside the Torah movements due to a misunderstanding of both the Greek term, often translated abolish, and the presence of the terms law and prophets, both of these in verse 17. Let me give you my bird's eye view of what's going on in the passage, followed by a deeper analysis of the statements made. I believe Jesus is giving an introduction to his commandment section of the Sermon on the Mount, in which it is going to sound like he's contradicting the scriptures. He's going to say, "You have heard it said, but I say." And though he is obviously not contradicting the scriptures, he's warning his audience not to think so ahead of time. He starts by speaking of all the scriptures, that he has not come to overthrow them, but rather to fulfill them, meaning to fulfill his role as Messiah that they predicted for him. The words of Scripture will not ever pass away, and so, like with the written Scriptures, whoever relaxes or shrinks back from what Jesus says will be least in the kingdom of heaven. He caps it off by saying that a person's righteousness must far exceed what his audience thought to be the greatest possible level of righteousness, that of the scribes and Pharisees, to enter the kingdom of heaven. Let's start in verse 17. Jesus is not talking about the commandments of the Torah, but all of the scriptures. Whenever you see law and prophets together like this, you are seeing the first century way of referring to all of the Hebrew scriptures. Also, you may have noticed that the translation I chose for my reading of the passage does not say abolish, but destroy. I did this to point out that though the verse has been traditionally translated with abolish, the meaning of the Greek term is to overthrow or destroy. In modern English, we typically only think of abolish in the context of nullifying laws, but that isn't the primary meaning of the Greek term kataluo used here. And this fits with the fact that Jesus is talking about all the Old Testament, not just laws. Jesus is saying that he did not come to destroy or overthrow the scriptures, but to fulfill them. Jesus isn't addressing, in verse 17, commandments in particular, but the scriptures as a whole, and not overthrowing them. For another point of evidence on this, consider how Young's literal translation, which seeks the most literal English word for every Greek term, regardless how clunky it sounds, renders the verse. Matthew 5:17, YLT. Do not suppose that I came to throw down the law or the prophets. I did not come to throw down, but to fulfill. Now, an interesting thing to ask here is why Jesus says this in the first place. Why is he telling people not to even think that he came to destroy the scriptures? Well, it makes a lot of sense as an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount's section on commandments. Jesus is about to talk about various commandments and give his own teaching on them, and it is going to sound a bit like he's correcting them. He's not, of course, but it's going to sound like he is. The term fulfill throughout Matthew up to this point has always referred to the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus came to do what the scriptures said he would do. This is the proper framing of the text. Jesus is talking about himself and what the scriptures say about him. Remember, the verse clearly says this is about the law and the prophets. This is whole Bible language. So in both the immediate context, law and prophets or whole Bible, and the broader context of Matthew, the consistent use of this term fulfill up to this point, it is clear Jesus is speaking of fulfilling all that the scriptures say about him. Many Torah observers like to go to the lexicon and pick and choose what part of the range of meaning they like best and insert it here. They like to insist that it means fill up or perform. while also acting as though the verse is only about commandments in the Torah. They try to say that Jesus is saying he came to obey the whole law here. Certainly that is part of it. Part of what was required for him to be Messiah is to keep the law. But that doesn't mean that fulfill can be interpreted apart from the rest of the context. When we see it in its proper context, the verse presents no doctrinal difficulties, unless you're committed to Torah observance theology, which is why they have to try to change it. It's important to point out here how what we've already discussed refutes the common argument from Torah keepers. If you think fulfill just means to abolish, then you're saying Jesus said he didn't come to abolish, but rather to abolish the law.
Yeshua is not saying, I did not come to destroy the law, but to end it. This is an absurd translation because it makes no sense in the context. It's no different than saying, I did not come to destroy the law, but to destroy it.
Yeshua said he came to do one and not the other. They cannot therefore mean the same thing. However, we are informed by the church leaders that they basically mean the same thing and bring about the same result.
I bring this up because I regularly hear that when Christ says that he's not abolished the Torah, but that he has completed it, it means that complete means to finish it. And finish means to bring it to an end. So the Torah may not be abolished, but it's ended. That's an oxymoron if I ever heard one.
This is, of course, juvenile and a straw man. Jesus did not come to overthrow the law or prophets, but to fulfill them. Both of these terms can and do speak of something coming to an end, but with an obvious and important difference. The term for destroy is inherently antagonistic. Jesus is not coming as an enemy of the Scriptures, commandments or otherwise. Fulfill is harmonious. To bring something to its designed conclusion is not the same as overthrowing it. Torah teachers are guilty of ignoring important distinctions when they make this silly argument. To put it in the context of the interpretation already provided, consider the fulfillment of prophecy. Is a prophetic prediction destroyed when it's fulfilled? Obviously not. Is it no longer scripture? That's absurd. But has something changed? Certainly. Believers are supposed to look at unfulfilled prophecy in hope for the future, watching for its fulfillment. Once fulfilled, believers are no longer to look forward to fulfillment, but rather look back on God's faithfulness in the fulfillment that happened. Our relationship to the prophecy changes with the fulfillment. The text never changed, it never stopped being scripture, but our expected response is different. This is seen in clear and stark detail in the Gospels. When the Jewish leaders who clearly knew and claimed to believe what the Scriptures said about the Messiah refused to believe in him when he came. Their disobedience could be hidden before, but not after. The event changed how people were supposed to approach those texts, and on a deeply moral level. Verse 18 continues this theme of the tenacity of the Scriptures. Jesus says that the Scriptures will continue to exist and be knowable until everything in them is accomplished. When he says the law here in verse 18, Jesus is still not talking about particular commandments. He's using this term to refer, just as he did before, to the whole of the Scriptures. We can know this for several reasons. First, Jesus refers to the Scriptures with the term law elsewhere. In John 10:34, he says, "In your law," it says, and then he goes on to cite Psalm 82. So Jesus is well aware of the different ways law can be used, and uses them. This means context must determine what he's talking about. Here in Matthew 5, he just said law and prophets together, which is unambiguously a reference to the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. And what he says in verse 18 is a continuation of the same thought, not a change in subject. Second, the term translated pass away never gets used the way Torah observers interpret it here. Notice that it appears twice in the verse. The first time, it refers to the destruction of heaven and earth, their passing away out of existence. That is not the meaning the Torah movements use for the second occurrence in the verse. When it says not the smallest part of the law will pass away, it clearly does not mean to them to pass out of existence. This is because we still have it. We still know what it is. We still have the Scriptures. No, what the Torah person needs this to mean is for the law to not become non-binding. This is the meaning they need in order to appeal to this text for their theology. A simple question then becomes, does pass away ever mean that? Well, no, not ever. Jesus did use the term in a way that mirrors what we have here in Matthew 5, contrasting heaven and earth with the words of God and the words of Christ. Matthew 24:35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What do we see? Jesus, using similar language but now near the end of his ministry, speaks of his own words as not passing away. Of course, Jesus' words include a lot more than commandments. Jesus is once again speaking in this more broad category and drawing the same parallel. Passing away is what heaven and earth will do, but not his words. His words are preserved for us, just as the scriptures are. The key takeaway here is that the Torah observance position cannot maintain the same meaning for pass away both times it appears in Matthew 5:18, but they have to gloss over this fact whenever talking about it. The traditional view, though, is perfectly consistent here. Heaven and earth will pass away, but the scriptures will remain, and we will always have them to learn from. The subject just isn't whether certain commands given to Moses will always be binding in the same way as they were when first given. Finally, we see from the clear parallel between the term fulfilled in verse 17 and the term accomplished here in verse 18 that Jesus is speaking of the accomplishment of all that the scriptures say concerning himself. Again, Jesus is giving revelation about himself throughout the passage. Jesus came to fulfill the scriptures, and the scriptures will not pass out of knowledge until all that he has to do is accomplished. So let me make it clear what I'm saying here. The Torah teachers argue that all of the commandments given to Moses must be in effect, without change, until heaven and earth pass away. I have no quarrel with the way the Torah teachers interpret heaven and earth. I'm just pointing out that theirs is an impossible interpretation because they do not properly see how the terms law and prophets are used in the New Testament, nor do they apply a consistent understanding to the term pass away as found here in verse 18. On their interpretation, Jesus has to change meanings without warning right in the middle of an actual comparison using that term. On the traditional Christian view, Jesus is not talking about commandments and how they relate to us in another covenant. Rather, Jesus is talking about prophecy, and he is not changing definitions for pass away right in the middle. Until heaven and earth pass out of existence, the scriptures will not pass out of existence until everything they proclaim is accomplished. Coming then to verse 19, we find Jesus' first clear reference to commandments. And this reference is to these commandments. Now, since Jesus has yet to make any reference to commandments at this point, and since the remainder of his sermon is going to be heavy with talk about commandments, it's clear that these commandments is introductory to the next section of the sermon, where he contrasted prior commandments, both from the Torah and from traditions, with his own teaching. It is obvious from Jesus' teaching there that "but I say" precedes those commandments that Jesus wants his hearers to adopt and obey. It is Jesus' own commandments, given in this sermon, that are in view when Jesus judges those who annul these commandments. Jesus is not teaching continued Torah observance, nor is he teaching that we are free from obeying God. He is giving us the framework for how to keep his commandments, related to his new covenant. The parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and the giving of the law at Sinai are clear. Just as Moses gave the law of the Sinai covenant, Jesus is giving the law according to the new covenant. We see this as well when we look at verse 20, where Jesus says that our righteousness must surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees to enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus follows verse 20 with a list of examples of what this greater righteousness looks like. It's not just that breaking the law brings condemnation. Even keeping the law, if it's only the letter and not in the heart or in the deeper principle of that law, just isn't good enough. Of course, this lofty standard sets us up for the gospel, which is the point, but by bringing the full weight of the moral law of God to bear in order to show us how hopeless our situation really is. I have gone into much more detail on the commandments Jesus talks about here. For now, this is enough to answer the case put forward by the Torah observers. Their appeals to Matthew 5, while sounding good when you don't look too closely, are found to be inconsistent and full of inventive ways of interpreting Jesus' words in order to make them fit into their theological system.